All right, good morning, everybody. Can you guys hear me now?
I think it is.
Good morning, everybody. Very good start. We get started here. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm sorry we're getting a little bit behind, but hopefully we'll catch up as we go here. Welcome to the Senate Visiting Center. Thanks for the Senate teams who have helped us with this event. And thank you again for joining our launch event to launch the Syrian Accountability Working Group. My name is Mohammed Bakr Zubayz. I am the president of Citizens for Security of America, an NGO that is based in the US and work for democratic and free Syria, advocate for all Syrians. The Syrian uprising started more than 12 years ago. Since then, the Assad regime has murdered more than 600,000 people in the most brutal of ways. They attacked villages with chemical weapons, killing, maiming, and destroying entire communities. They dropped more than 82,000 primitive, barbaric burial bombs, slaughtering more than 11,000 people and more than 1,000 children. They murdered people in front of mass graves, watching their souls go lifeless in the ditch filled with scores of corpses. And thousands of Syrians have just disappeared. Some into the best prison system, and others killed at a time and place yet unknown. I want to share a couple of stories that some of you are familiar with, just to reflect some of the horrible scenes that we see and we've seen and witnessed over the last 12 years. First is Dr. Rania Abbasi. I think the majority of you might be familiar with her story. She's a dentist, an Arab and Syrian chess champion who was detained in 2012, along with her 6 children, ages between 1 and 14 years, and her husband as well 2 days before that, in Damascus, allegedly because of quote-unquote financial assistance to displaced family from Homs that moved to Damascus. Until now, we have no idea where she's at with her family. It's just one story of one family of the Syrian families. Another story is my own family. My mom, who was 7 years old at the time, an English teacher. My sister, with her 2 daughters, 11 and 7 years old at the time, and her husband. My brother's wife, who was pregnant and just gave birth to a newborn. All of them were detained in 2015. Just because me and my brother were just loud and active about what's happening to the Syrian people in Hud at the time. So much horror, so much loss, so many atrocities, yet little justice for the perpetrators and virtually no accountability for a regime guilty of an array of war crimes and crimes against humanity, unequaled in its brutality in the 21st century. Friends, the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad and his regime have faced no repercussions for their actions. Very few have been put on trial and convicted in a few European countries. It's long past time. That's why we are here today, to advance the cause of justice and accountability for the victims of the Assad regime. The working group we're setting up today has as its mission to find ways to hold the regime accountable and to bring justice to its most vicious perpetrators. Maybe that means better information sharing between countries and jurisdictions. Maybe that means expanded use of universal jurisdiction to other third countries that can arrest, indict, and try perpetrators. And maybe that means setting up a criminal tribunal specifically for Syria. But there must be more and better ways to hold violations accountable. These criminals cannot be allowed to walk this earth without the knowledge that the world knows what they did, and someday they will be accountable. That's why I'm glad we're forming this working group. And I'm hopeful that it will offer constructive ideas to policymakers, law enforcement, prosecutors, and judicial officials, so Syrians all around the world will know they are not forgotten and deserve justice. I would note that 2 members of this group were unable to join us today due to just unforeseeable circumstances. Ambassador Fred Hoff and Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. I think most of you are familiar with them. They have great wealth of knowledge about the Syria issue, and they were happy to join the group and provide insight and share their knowledge. Please allow me to introduce our event moderator, Dr. Paul Williams. Dr. Williams holds the Rebecca Razier Professorship in Law and in International Relations at the American University, where he teaches in the School of International Services, and at the Washington College of Law. Dr. Williams is also the co-founder of the Public International Law and Policy Groups, PILPG, the co-sponsor of this event today, a pro bono law firm providing legal assistance to states and governments involved in peace negotiations, post-conflict, constitution drafting, and the prosecution of war criminals. As a world-renowned peace negotiating lawyer, Dr. Williams has assisted over 24 parties in major international peace negotiations and has advised numerous parties on the drafting and implementation of post-conflict constitutions. Several of Dr. Williams' pro bono government clients throughout the world joined together to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. What an achievement. Dr. Williams, without further ado.
Thank you, Dr. Bacher, for those moving introductory remarks and for setting the framework for both the discussion that we will be having this morning with our esteemed panelists and also for the work of the Syrian Accountability Working Group. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Syrian Accountability Working Group here in the United States Capitol. Now, the Syrian Accountability Working Group was formed to advance the cause of justice in Syria and to support and to advocate for the utilization, where necessary, the creation of mechanisms to hold accountable those responsible for atrocity crimes committed against the people of Syria. Accountability and justice more broadly are crucial to creating a durable peace in Syria. They are imperative for victim healing and victim catharsis. They are necessary to stop the ongoing atrocity crimes and deter future crimes in Syria. And they are crucial for deterring atrocity crimes more broadly. Notably, the recent situation in Ukraine has demonstrated a number of important lessons for the conflict in Syria. There are serious consequences for a failure to deter those responsible for atrocity crimes. We saw what Russia did in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Syria, and now Ukraine. There's a pattern of bad behavior, a pattern of atrocity crimes, if it is not cut off by accountability and justice. We've also realized that there is a global commitment to accountability and to the prevention of atrocity crimes, something that the working group in particular is focused on, tapping into that global commitment in order to stop the atrocity crimes in Syria. However, the situation in Ukraine has also demonstrated that the landscape for accountability is patchy at best and requires substantial and persistent dedication, focus, and advocacy to bring perpetrators of atrocity crimes to justice. And that is the mission of the Syrian Accountability Working Group. Now, to kick off the launch of the Syrian Accountability Working Group, I have the distinct privilege of introducing my good friend, the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schack. Ambassador Van Schack advises the Secretary of State on a daily basis on preventing and responding to crimes against humanity. She has a strong background that I think many of us are jealous of in academia, the practice of law, and government service. And she even served as the deputy to her predecessor 10 years ago. So she's been in this track of global accountability for many years. Now, recently, she was the Leah Kaplan Visiting Professor for Human Rights at Stanford University before being lured back into government service. Ambassador Van Schack is widely published. I actually assigned many of her works to my students in my class at American University. And then I tell stories, behind the scenes stories about Ambassador Van Schack. And she recently published a work with Oxford University Press, Imagining Justice for Syria. She has served as the academic advisor to the United States Interagency Delegation to the International Criminal Court Review Conference in Kampala. And earlier in her career, she was a practicing lawyer for the Center for Justice and Accountability, a human rights law firm, and in the office of the prosecutor for the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal. I can think of no one better to inaugurate the deliberations of our working group. Her work is our work. Her mission is our mission. She is a true believer and a powerful force for justice and accountability in Syria and around the globe. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Beth Van Schack.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And I apologize for being the cause of our starting late. I think Assad and Uber were conspiring this morning, but I would not be deterred.
And Putin.
So, well, and Putin for that matter.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed. But really, it's wonderful to be here. And I've heard a lot about this initiative, and we've been talking for several months about it. And it's so exciting to see it now finally launched. So thank you to C4SSA and for PILPG for having the foresight to conceptualize this really important and needed working group, and to inspiring its work going forward. And I look forward to having my office be a strong supporter, however we can, within the US government. So what I thought I would do just to kick us off is map out a little bit of the landscape of accountability when it comes to Syria. But I think, Paul, your remarks setting this within the context of Ukraine is really important because we see now the consequences of impunity for grave international crimes in places like Syria, that the same bad actors will have a green light to essentially continue their malfeasance in other conflict situations. And literally everywhere that we have seen Russia deploy its forces, we have seen the kinds of international law violations that we saw in Syria and are still seeing in Syria and now are seeing in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world. So it really is a call to commit as a globe and as a government and as civil society actors to the imperative of justice and accountability. So as is well known, the situation in Syria poses an acute and I've argued in my book, even somewhat of an existential challenge to the international community's commitment to justice and accountability. I wrote the book at a time when I was somewhat pessimistic about this commitment, but I think Paul is right that seeing the connections between Syria and now Ukraine has enlivened within the international community a broader commitment to revisit the need to work together to think about solutions for justice, because I think people are recognizing the consequences further of impunity. And I often describe this as a tide rising, that as you see attention to Ukraine, institution building, norm strengthening, prosecutions happening, that all boats will rise, I hope, in this tide of justice. And so I hope that this will enliven and encourage and inspire new attention to the situation in Syria. So as you described, Dr. Becker, the atrocities that we've seen in Syria really shock the conscience. And they run the gamut from attacks on civilians and the civilian infrastructure. We've seen deliberate, disproportionate, and all kinds of attacks on civilians and the civilian infrastructure. We've seen the misuse of conventional and unconventional weapons, including multiple breaches of the longstanding taboo against the use of chemical weapons. We've seen industrial grade custodial abuses in a vast network of formal and informal prison systems, unrelenting siege warfare, the denial of humanitarian aid, which has now been brought to the fore again after the terrible, devastating earthquake experienced by this region, and what appears to be the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war. We've also seen sexual violence, of trafficking of Yazidi women and girls, but also of people in detention, including men and boys, and the intentional destruction of irreplaceable cultural property. Over 150,000 Syrians remain detained and or disappeared and missing. There is now a new initiative within the United Nations General Assembly to create a mechanism to try and identify the location. And I know that Mohammed and SJAC have been very involved in this as well. And so we may hear more about that. Thousands of lives have been lost. Millions of civilians remain displaced internally within Syria or externally across a border. Their life plans indelibly disrupted by this war. And the violence, of course, has contributed to an exodus of refugees that has not been seen since the World War II period. So recognizing the gravity of the situation, the United States has identified through a careful fact-based determination that the Assad regime has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. The conflict in Syria, as a bright spot, has seen unprecedented levels of documentation. This is not a substitute for justice, I want to be clear, but we do know that any measure of transitional justice is going to require solid, reliable documentation. And that is where civil society organizations like those represented here have been critical. And I'm pleased that the US government has been able to support these organizations' work through our programming arms. Many organizations are working in this space. We also have a United Nations Commission of Inquiry that continues to put out very important reports. Because of debility at the Security Council, the General Assembly has started to flex its muscles and created an independent international investigative mechanism devoted to the situation in Syria. This has taken what would we think about as human rights reporting and documentation and tried to impose more criminal law standards, collecting, preserving, and analyzing information from a number of different sources, including civil society actors, but also governments, to the highest criminal law standards so that that information can be used in any variety of accountability exercises. The Organization for the Prohibition on the Use of Chemical Weapons has also made a turn towards accountability. I was just in The Hague and I had a day-long set of meetings involving chemical weapon use in Syria. And what we've seen is an organization that began as a very technical organization that was focused on the implementation of the treaty against chemical weapons has now taken on an accountability mandate by virtue of, again, the Security Council being overtaken by Russia's veto. There was a joint investigative mechanism that had been created by the Security Council. Russia then refused to allow that mandate to be continued. And so states within the OPCW stepped up and empowered that organization to create an investigative team that is able to not only investigate the use of chemical weapons, but attribute responsibility, and has now done so in multiple cases with respect to the Assad regime and also with respect to ISIL actors within Syria. Now, we've also seen a newfound partnership between civil society actors and law enforcement actors. And that partnership has not always existed, but it's been very fruitful in the Syrian context. We see Syrian civil society organizations being essential partners in accountability in domestic systems. They are not only collecting information, but they're doing so to a criminal law standard. They're analyzing that evidence with a deep knowledge of the context in which that information is being generated. They're identifying witnesses that are willing and able to testify about their experience, and they're accompanying those witnesses through a justice process so that it is empowering to them to participate, rather than, as we have seen in the past, sometimes witnesses feeling like they're simply a tool of a prosecutorial process. They're actually full partners now in designing and implementing justice, and that's very much due to partnerships between civil society actors and justice actors. Civil society actors are also able to identify perpetrators within diaspora communities. We know that perpetrators eventually leave. They eventually defect. They eventually want to escape a wartime situation. They understand that they may be held accountable. They try and hide within their host communities, looking for safe haven, but then they are recognized on the street, at the market. And when law enforcement has a trusted relationship with civil society actors, members of those diaspora communities will have faith in law enforcement, will call them and say, I saw a guy that detained my brother, or I recognize that person from the center where I was detained, or I know that person was a part of the Assad insider regime. And they'll call attention to those individuals. They can then be fully investigated and cases can be brought. Now, although we've had extensive documentation in the situation in Syria, we have also seen the rise of new technological tools. Syria was, and I think may still be, although Ukraine may be overtaking this, the most documented crime base in all of human history. And this is because so many ordinary people had cell phones and were able to record the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity in their local communities. The problem now, however, is there's so much digital documentation. There are so many digital artifacts of war crimes and crimes against humanity that we need to develop technological tools to evaluate, to verify their veracity, to identify the best evidence when there are multiple copies of a particular video, and to be able to authenticate that information. And I know that the SJAC and others are very much involved in this, and we can speak more about that later. Now, all of this documentation, the hope, of course, is that it will feed into accountability processes. And in that respect, the pathways to justice have been more limited when it comes to Syria. We saw in 2014, an effort by a number of states to refer the matter of Syria to the International Criminal Court. Russia exercised its veto with China in tow, so there was a double veto that prevented that referral from going forward. There were many very creative ideas about the way in which an ad hoc standalone international tribunal could have been created for Syria. There was insufficient political will to move forward with any of those proposals. And so there is no broad international response other than the IIIM, which is doing documentation and proto-indictments, but cannot take the next step and actually hold anyone accountable. So what we have seen instead is that domestic courts are stepping up and filling the impunity gap in a remarkable way to a degree that we have not ever seen. States are utilizing their national legislation to press charges against everyone from senior members of the Assad regime to more lower level rank and file to members of ISIL who are also committing abuses across the battle space. Powerful trials such as the trial of Anwar Raslan in Germany, for example, or the Jumaili case also in Germany, both issuing important judgments on the Commission of International Crimes, including crimes against Yazidi people. Courts in Sweden and France and elsewhere are also engaged in bringing cases involving Syria. The exercise of this extraterritorial jurisdiction has been facilitated by a number of key developments in national systems. So number one is the incorporation of international crimes in domestic penal codes. These cases cannot be brought unless there are criminal charges that can be alleged involving crimes and acts that happened extraterritorially, involving foreign nationals and involving foreign victims. But we're seeing these forms of universal jurisdiction being incorporated within a number of domestic codes. The second is robust regimes of mutual legal assistance. Prosecutorial authorities across national systems working together in joint investigative teams or otherwise to share information, to share strategies, to inspire each other, to move forward, to bring what are concededly very difficult cases to bring and to win. We've seen the formation of national war crimes units that have specialists in this work. So it's not ordinary prosecutors having to understand what is a war crime, what is the crime, and what is happening in Syria, where is Syria? Instead, they have specialists who include anthropologists and historians within their ranks who can explain the larger context in which crimes are happening. As more cases are brought, we've seen growing confidence among prosecutors willing to take the risks and assume the costs of bringing extraterritorial cases. And as I mentioned, we have this new interoperability between civil society actors, national actors working together in the interest of justice. There's a whole new architecture now that is being created, and that is empowering domestic courts to play a role in justice. Now, we have to concede that these cases are episodic. They cannot possibly cover the whole realm of the needs for justice. Not every individual will have access to a court that deserves it. But I think we should still welcome these exercises of justice by national courts. Number one, they're creating important precedent that other courts can then apply, strengthening the law, the substantive law that we're using. They're providing national war crimes units with valuable experience prosecuting these cases so they have greater confidence. They do offer a measure of justice for victims, the victims whose case it is, who are able to testify live and bear witness to what they experience, but also other survivors who can see and enjoy justice through the eyes of others, the cases of others. They can recognize their case in the cases that are brought and have a sense that the world has not forgotten what happened in Syria. They can deny safe haven to perpetrators. They can't just enjoy living a quiet life in Europe somewhere, but rather they're being forced now to face justice and answer for their crimes. And they're punishing individuals for horrific acts. They also provide a measure of stability. We know that in victim communities, there can be efforts at self-help or retribution, which can undermine faith in those victim communities. And if there is a proper formal pathway to justice, that will, I hope, alleviate those concerns about wanting to take justice into their own hands. So these singular cases can be highly salient. They draw a lot of press interest. They inspire others. And they show that justice is possible and may help to overcome resistance that may be experienced at a political level in other states. And so on the whole, we should be cheering and finding ways to support this. And I know that this new working group will do this. I just want to mention civil redress. There tends to be a strong focus on criminal accountability, but there are also pathways to civil redress. First is the International Court of Justice. In an unprecedented way, we are seeing states willing to bring other states before the ICJ and accuse them of violating their treaty obligations. So this started with Belgium and Senegal. Then we saw it with respect to the Gambia bringing Myanmar under the Genocide Convention. Now Ukraine has brought Russia, or sorry, well, technically Russia brought Ukraine under the Genocide Convention, but Ukraine is arguing that Russia is manipulating and misusing the Genocide Convention. But when it comes to Syria, we have the Netherlands and the United Kingdom bringing a case, and Canada, Canada, I think the United Kingdom is joining too, right? Aren't they?
Yeah. For now, it's Netherlands and Canada.
Okay, but they haven't,
UK
okay.
is joining.
Sorry, they're joining. Maybe that's not public information yet. Let's keep it in this group. Charging Syria with violating its sovereign obligations under the Convention Against Torture for the network of torture that has been, of torture centers that have been set up across Syria. At least we know 12,000 individuals from the Caesar photos were subjected to horrible torture. So we have direct evidence of the Assad regime's responsibility here. And these treaties allow for the International Court of Justice to exercise jurisdiction over claims around the enforcement or application of the treaty. And so the ICJ is becoming now a tool of international justice. We've also had here in the United States an important suit against the state of Syria under the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. There is an exception to sovereign immunity for state sponsors of terror. Of course, Syria has been designated as a state sponsor of terror for many years. That opened US courtrooms up, unfortunately only for US citizens. But the family of the renowned war correspondent who cared deeply about the situation in Syria, who put her life literally on the line and lost her life in Syria, they brought suit against the state of Syria, winning a $300 million judgment against the state. Now, while we can cheer that result, we also have to acknowledge that this is a single US citizen winning this judgment, and there isn't a pathway to use the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act for Syrian survivors or their families. So in conclusion, we see that the situation in Syria really reflects two countervailing trends. On the one hand, we have robust investigative methods, we have incredible documentation, verified, analyzed, et cetera, but very limited pathways to justice. And so that's, I think, where this initiative is going to be incredibly important. So I really look forward to our conversation today and to being a part going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Benchak. Thank you, Ambassador Benchak, for those compelling remarks reminding us of the role that accountability and justice plays in bringing about an end to the conflict and the establishment of a durable peace, and for reminding us why it's so important for the work of the Syrian Accountability Working Group in terms of building public support building momentum for holding those responsible, holding them to account for their atrocity crimes. We will now shift into the part of the conversation where we will touch on many of the issues that Ambassador Venchak noted. In a moment, we'll turn to two of our guests, one remotely and one in person, to address the questions of the use of chemical weapons and the consequences of their use. We will then dive deeply with Professor Melina Stereo into the question of universal jurisdiction, the current state of universal jurisdiction, and how it might be amplified and used to a greater degree to hold individuals responsible for atrocity crimes. And then we'll touch on documentation and the situation with detainees, Mohammed as our final speaker, and we'll have Q&A after each speaker for a brief period of time. So with that, let's turn into the conversation on chemical weapons. We have joining us over Zoom, Ms. Lubna Al-Qanawati. In the early days of the Syrian revolution, Ms. Al-Qanawati has documented violations, advocated against human rights abuses by the Assad regime and other militia groups. She has supported fellow civilians as a community leader and an activist. In 2013, she witnessed the sarin gas attack in East Ghouta, as well as other violations of international law and the commission of atrocity crimes by the regime. Ms. Al-Qanawati has supported Syrian women through her advocacy, research, human rights work with the Women Now for Development organization, and focuses her efforts on advancing accountability on chemical weapons attacks on Syrian civilians, preventing gender-based violence, and supporting transformative justice. Lubna, welcome to the roundtable.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Bakr, for inviting me. I was preparing myself to give an intervention, but as usual, it's always difficult for me to speak about the chemical weapon and the attack and about my personal experience, even though that I identify myself as a good speaker, but it's always very emotional to me to speak about what happened and to speak also, to feel this kind of very moral responsibility toward all the victims of the chemical weapons. I want to add also that I am a member of the Association of Victims of Chemical Attack, and I'm also lived under siege for 2 years, and then I fled to Turkey. Then I am now in France. What I remember, I will give a very quick brief about my personal experience in Eastern Ghouta, but I want to focus about what justice for me as a survival and how I see it also as a woman, because I am usually focused on the gender impact of the chemical attack and how it's affects differently women, children, and men. So what I want to say that everything happened since decade, since 2013 till now. For me, it's like it's all around the massacre. I feel like I'm stamped with the accident, with this massacre, and I cannot move on. I always feel stuck about what happened, and every kind of violation added to this massacre, it's triggered all the trauma about what happened that night. Unfortunately, as the ambassador said, there is tens of reports and a lot of documentation about the chemical attack prove that Assad regime is involved in the most of it, the majority of it, but so far we didn't find any kind of justice. I always feel like that we left alone as a survival. we left stuck in the moment of the massacre without the ability to move on. Because what's happened for me as a person in 2013 and the promises for justice that didn't achieved, it was very frustrating, and it's made me feel like I lost hope in justice. And that's always been like also at the same time a motivation for me to speak my story and to advocate more about the chemical attack and the survival of the chemical attack. As we know that this is one of the most crimes that's been facing disinformation in these decades from especially the Russian and the Syrian regime. So what I want to say that for years, for so many years after the chemical attack, I lived the daily fear to sleep at night, to worry about close or open my windows, living with the faces of children I saw. And at that time, I was a graphic designer, so I had a very ugly experience because back to 2013, I was one of two parties that has a printer, a plotter in Eastern Ghouta, and that's give me the ability to print funeral announcement. So I spent the week after the massacre just printing funeral announcement for people who died in the massacre, children and women and families, printing their names and their pictures. I lived with these memories until now, and I feel responsible to honor them. Unfortunately, what never happened after the massacre, the accountability that we never see, never witnessed, give impunity to the regime and allow them to commit several massacres after this. And we witnessed what happened in Khan Sheikhoun and in Al-Latamne and then in Douma again, and more than 200 chemical attacks have been committed. So, and so far the criminal is free, and he still has the ability to commit more crimes. And he erased all the evidence from the territory that he gained back from Eastern Ghouta and Khan Sheikhoun. And now we don't have even the land to honor the people who died. Another thing that we face now, it's the intimidation of witnesses for chemical attack. So far, there is no mechanism to protect those witnesses. Even the states that took the step for justice using the universal jurisdiction to launch cases or tribunal against some individual, there is no kind of mechanism to protect witnesses. And this is a very huge problem because even if we want to talk about witnesses, it's very difficult now to bring anyone to talk about chemical attack, especially if this person is a woman. We know that there is a huge intimidation to speak about this kind of experience. We're still facing this huge obstacle about passing the Security Council to have any resolution toward accountability, because we always face the Russian veto. So I hope this launching event, this accountability group will really bring any kind of new mechanism, and this will and this promises for justice will move into turn into action, and to bring us some peace, to hold accountable the criminal, to honor the people who died, and not to die for vain, and also to allow us as a survival move on in our lives. And yeah, that's all what I want to share. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Alkanawati, for sharing with us your very personal and your very moving experience, and for reminding us why accountability is so important for victim catharsis and as a way and a means of honoring those victims. Staying with the topic of chemical weapons, we will now turn the microphone to Dr. Salim Namour. Dr. Namour is a general surgeon who was forcefully displaced from East Ghouta. He was the founder of the Al-Khalif Hospital in East Ghouta in Damascus suburbs from 2011 to 2018. He treated many of the patients during the siege by Assad's regime of East Ghouta, as well as the victims of several chemical attacks, particularly in 2013, where he himself was also affected by those chemical attacks. He was the coordinator for the International Investigation Committee that entered Eastern Ghouta in 2013, and he helped found the Association of Victims of Chemical Weapons, and is the chair currently of an organization that is registered in Europe, focusing on demanding justice for victims and families of victims of the chemical weapons attacks in Syria. Dr. Namour, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Bob. I'm the chairman of the board of Association of Victims of Chemical Weapons. Our association has been established August 2022 and registered in France. The members are survivors of chemical attacks and the families of the victims. We strive for three main aims. We strive for the victims' rights, for preventing impunity and to hold Assad regime accountable. We strive for a world, a clean world of the chemical weapons. We believe after the International Inquiry Committee's reports and after the OPCW reports that the world should move from investigation to charge the Assad regime. The resolution 2118 has become 10 years old. We are asking, shall we wait for another 10 years? We feel as victims that the world is hiding behind the Russian military. I would like to tell you what is the result of failure of not holding Assad regime accountable. Syrian community has become a community of victims, victims of detention, victims of tortures, as noted in Caesar Bell. Siege, barrels bomb, chemical attacks, and forced displacement, and finally, victims of drugs and capital. Assad impunity after the first use of chemical weapon has encouraged him to use it more than 200 times till now. Don't you believe that Assad impunity will encourage the other evil dictator regimes such as North Korea and Iran to produce and use the chemical weapons in their conflicts? Assad impunity for the chemical attacks may encourage him to use it outside Syria, as Russia does with the opposition activists. I would like to remind that Russia's impunity for its crimes in Syria since 2015 has encouraged it to repeat the same crimes in Ukraine. As you know, the production and the use of the chemical weapons in Syria is supervised by Russia and Iran. That's why Assad accountable will weaken Russia and Iran and make them think twice before planning to use it in another conflict. Finally, let us stand together for the victims' rights and prevent impunity to build a safe and secure future for the next generation in Syria, United States, and over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Namour, for reminding us why it is so important, crucial, in fact, to hold Assad and his regime accountable for the atrocity crimes that he has committed. In line with holding individuals accountable, we will now turn the microphone to Professor Milena Stereo to address the topic of universal jurisdiction, with Ambassador Beth Shak touched on. Milena Stereo is the chaired professor of law at Cleveland State University's College of Law, and she's also the managing director of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Milena recently testified before the US Senate on the need and the approach to accountability in Syria. And just last month, she spoke before members of the United Nations General Assembly on the need for global accountability. Professor Stereo is a world-renowned expert on justice and accountability and the mechanisms that exist to prosecute those responsible for atrocity crimes. She leads PILPG's Thought Initiative, which regularly convenes roundtables consisting of former war crimes prosecutors, victims and survivors, and those that are thinking through how best practical to prosecute those responsible for atrocity crimes. Her latest book, The Syrian Conflict's Impact on International Law, a few free copies available afterwards if anyone would like them, co-authored with a couple of other professors, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020 and awarded an international prize for outstanding scholarly contribution to the field of international law. Milena, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Paul, for the very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and participate in the official launch of the Syria Justice and Accountability Working Group. In my presentation, I will focus on the principle of universal jurisdiction, which can provide an important accountability avenue for the prosecution of those who have committed atrocities in Syria. First, I will outline the basics of universal jurisdiction, and second, I will discuss the use of universal jurisdiction to prosecute Syrian perpetrators of atrocities. Now, not to give away my ending, but let me just say right now that universal jurisdiction can be used and has been used to impose accountability across different national level courts on those who have committed atrocities in Syria. So first, what is universal jurisdiction? Universal jurisdiction provides every state with the authority to prosecute a limited category of offenses generally recognized as of universal concern, regardless of where the offense occurred, the nationality of the perpetrator, or the nationality of the victim. While other bases of jurisdiction require connections between the prosecuting state and the offense, the perpetrator, or the victim, universal jurisdiction assumes that every state has sufficient interest in exercising jurisdiction to combat egregious offenses that states have universally condemned. Now, there are two premises underlying universal jurisdiction. The first involves the gravity of the crime. Crimes subject to universal jurisdiction are so threatening to the international community or so heinous in scope and degree that they offend the interest of all humanity, and any state may, as humanity's agent, punish the offender. The second premise involves the place of the act. Crimes subject to universal jurisdiction occur in territory over which no country has jurisdiction, or in situations where the territorial state and the state of the accused nationality are unlikely to exercise jurisdiction because, for example, the perpetrators are state authorities or agents of the state, such as in the case of Syria. Now, the first widely accepted crime of universal jurisdiction was piracy. For about 500 years, states have exercised jurisdiction over acts of piracy on the high seas, even when neither the pirates nor the victims were nationals of the prosecuting states. To fast forward a little bit, in the aftermath of the atrocities of the Second World War, the international community extended universal jurisdiction to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Trials exercising universal jurisdiction took place in international tribunals at Nuremberg, as well as domestic courts across the globe. Some individuals faced trial in the states in which they had committed their crimes, but others were tried by other states in which they were later captured, surrendered, or found, including such far-off countries as Canada and Australia. Thus, on the basis of universal jurisdiction, Israel tried Adolf Eichmann in 1961 and John Demjanjuk in 1988 for crimes committed before Israel even existed as a state. In extending universal jurisdiction to war crimes and crimes against humanity, an analogy was made between those offenses and piracy. Like piracy, the Nazi offenses during the war involved violent and predatory action and were typically committed in locations where they would not be prevented or punished through other bases of jurisdiction. In 1946, the United Nations General Assembly unanimously affirmed the principles of international law recognized by the Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal and the judgment of the Tribunal, thereby codifying the jurisdictional right of all states to prosecute perpetrators of the offenses addressed by the Nuremberg Tribunal, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. The General Assembly has subsequently confirmed that no statute of limitations or amnesty may be applied to bar prosecution of such crimes, and that all states have a duty to cooperate in their prosecution. International courts have repeatedly cited the Nuremberg precedent as crystallizing universal jurisdiction for the core international crimes under customary international law. In the 1990s, domestic courts of Denmark, Austria, and Germany relied on universal jurisdiction in trying Croatian and Bosnian Serb nationals for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Bosnia in the 1990s. Courts in Belgium cited universal jurisdiction as a basis for issuing arrest warrants and prosecuting persons involved in the atrocities in Rwanda in 1994, including cases that did not involve Belgian victims. And courts in Spain relied on universal jurisdiction to request the extradition of former Chilean leader, General Augusto Pinochet, for crimes against humanity committed during his reign. Crimes over which universal jurisdiction extends today include piracy, slavery, war crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, genocide, and torture. Now, second, more specifically, what about the use of universal jurisdiction in the Syrian context? In the context of the Syrian conflict, some courts have already relied on the principle of universal jurisdiction to initiate investigations and prosecutions. Soon after the outbreak of the Syrian war, the German Federal Prosecutor's War Crimes Unit opened several so-called structural investigations into more than 2,800 crimes committed in Syria. This involves investigating specific structures within which international crimes have been allegedly committed rather than investigating specific persons. This technique serves several purposes. First, it can enable the prosecutor to react swiftly when a suspect enters Germany in the future. And second, it can facilitate future proceedings in a third state or before an international court. Third, it can lead to the opening of investigation against a specific individual and can serve as the basis for an international arrest warrant or extradition request. Taking advantage of the thousands of Syrian refugees pouring into Germany starting in 2011, the staff of the German War Crimes Unit interviewed over 200 witnesses in 2 structural investigations. One, as Ambassador Van Schaalk already mentioned, based on the Caesar photos, is focused on crimes committed by the Syrian regime as captured in thousands of photos smuggled out by a former Syrian official. And the other, based on interviews of Yazidi refugees in Germany, is focused on crimes committed by ISIS against the ethnic group in Syria. So far, the structural investigations have led to multiple investigations against more than 24 suspects. In June of 2018, Germany issued an international arrest warrant for the Syrian general Jamil Hassan, a member of Assad's inner circle, charging him with war crimes and crimes against humanity. In February of 2019, after the general traveled to Lebanon seeking medical treatment, Germany made a formal extradition request of Lebanon for his surrender. A few days later, the United States government issued a statement supporting Germany's extradition request for the high-ranking Syrian official, and by taking this step, the United States placed itself on the record in support of Germany's exercise of universal jurisdiction. And as already mentioned, in 2002, the higher regional court in Koblenz, Germany, convicted senior Assad government official Anwar Raslan for a crime against humanity in the form of killing, torture, serious unlawful detention, rape, and sexual assault, and sentenced him to life in prison. The court found that it had been proved that Raslan was a co-offender in a protracted and systematic attack that was launched against the civilian population of Syria, resulting in 27 people being murdered and 4,000 others having their physical freedom impaired in a serious manner. In February of 2021, the same court also convicted Raslan's co-defendant, Ayad al-Gharib. Germany is the first country to have launched these structural investigations related to Syria, and it established a model for other states wishing to serve the interest of a broader international fight against impunity. France has also embraced the strategy of structural investigations, with the limitation that French law requires that one or more of the victims of each case be a French national or the suspect is located in French territory. And actually, literally yesterday or today, the French Supreme Court is discussing a case involving a Syrian national, which actually might lead to a different interpretation of France's double criminality rule, which might allow for more prosecutions of Syrian nationals in France under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Now, using existing universal jurisdiction authority, in 2018, a French court issued international arrest warrants for 3 high-level Assad regime officials, charging them with complicity in the disappearance of dual French-Syrian nationals. A number of other European states have begun prosecuting Syrian perpetrators found in their territory under the so-called no safe haven approach. Most of these have ended with convictions, such as the Austrian case against a 27-year-old Syrian asylum seeker and former member of the opposition Farouk Brigade, who was sentenced to life in May of 2017. In Sweden, a 28-year-old Syrian asylum seeker and former member of the Free Syrian Army was sentenced to 8 years for war crimes and torture. And in September of 2017, a collective of Swiss lawyers disclosed the existence of a criminal investigation into Rifat al-Assad, Syrian President al-Assad's uncle, often referred to as the Butcher of Hama, for war crimes allegedly committed back in 1982. And in Netherlands in 2020 and 2021, an Amsterdam court prosecuted a Syrian national on charges of war crimes and terrorism under the principle of universal jurisdiction. As a result, to conclude, after falling out of favor during the past 20 years, countries around the world are expanding the use of the global enforcer approach to universal jurisdiction to prosecute Syrian officials and rebels for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The prosecution of Syrian leaders for atrocity crimes in the national courts of different countries around the globe under the principle of universal jurisdiction is thus an important accountability option. The prosecution of Syrian perpetrators of atrocity crimes is not under universal jurisdiction is not the only accountability avenue. It can be complemented by prosecutions at international and hybrid accountability mechanisms. And I would argue that all such investigative and prosecutorial efforts at the international, hybrid, and domestic levels can create a path toward accountability imposed on those who have committed atrocity crimes in Syria. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Stereo, for helping us to understand this concept of universal jurisdiction and the role that it is playing and can play in holding those responsible for atrocity crimes in Syria. Let me now turn to our last speaker, Mohammed Al Abdallah, who is the director of the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center. He is a Syrian human rights and democracy researcher and activist. He received his bachelor's of law from the Lebanese University and his master's of public policy from George Mason University with a specialty in governance and international institutions. Mohammed previously worked as a research assistant for Human Rights Watch in Beirut, where he covered Syria. He is also a former prisoner and survivor of torture who was imprisoned in Syria on 2 separate occasions for his work defending human rights and for lobbying for political reform. Mohammed has traveled extensively in the past years trying to put Syria, the issue of justice and accountability, and the need for a holistic transitional justice approach on the agenda of the most important political and human rights actors. He addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva and the UN General Assembly on multiple occasions about the human rights situation in Syria. Mohammed, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks everyone for having me here. I would like to speak about the detainees and issue of detention and disappearance in Syria. As everybody mentioned their remarks, as Ambassador Van Schaak mentioned, the Caesar photos, the scale of detention and disappearance in Syria is unprecedented. I happened to be a prisoner in Syria before the conflict in 2005, 2006. I happened to meet my father in the prison, in Sednaya military prison. He was also serving a prison term, and my brother Omar happened to be in the same prison, but we didn't have a family union in the same. But this give an example of how the Syrian government ruled the country even before 2011. Well, the level of violence and brutality was already there, but it's nothing compared post-2011. What happened post-2011, just pure murdering of people, as we've seen in the Caesar photos. And the Caesar photos were just the evidence we needed, actually, after we heard all the witness testimonies that we've seen a lot of people who survived detention. We just want to see that visually. And the images showed us the visual evidence of what happened. Now, we're left with a magnitude of a problem that's actually beyond the capacity of the civil society to deal with. It's kind of what Lubna touched on, that we kind of feel left behind. Basically, nobody is helping the Syrian people, specifically in the detainees issue. And here I want to mention a couple of points, and this is absolutely not a solution to the issue, but just a proposal for a solution or some ideas here. First is the concern of counting and the numbers of the detainees and missing in Syria. Because when we talk about detainees, the detention and disappearance are commingled. Basically, somebody detained 2 weeks in communicated detention, they ended up being disappeared. A lot of those disappeared and ended up dead in custody. Some of them, we heard about them and we've seen their pictures in the Caesar photos, but a lot of them died and were executed in Sednaya prison with no knowledge of them. So to know who's detained, who's alive, and who's dead is a big question there. And there's a lot of numbers floating around, tens of thousands, 100,000, 130,000, 100, etc. thousands. And these numbers are problematic because they do not cover what's happening in Syria. They're based on estimates only. Even for the organization, we do documentation really well, and we don't have the numbers. Even the organizations who do the documentation, they can claim of the numbers, but there's a lot of cases where people documented detained were released by bribing some officials, and their families are scared, so they don't want to update us on the release. Or some families reported their loved ones detained. Eventually, they learned they were actually killed by their cousins in the next door because they have a dispute in the property. And the cousins run to the family and say, hey, your son was snatched on the checkpoint there, and we sue him. And the family was under pressure for 3 years, and this is a case we documented in Daraa. The family was paying bribes to the officials in Damascus to give them letters and exchange and send medication and food and things to the family. And the person was not even detained by the security agencies in Syria, by the Syrian government. So the scale of detention is unprecedented, and the unfortunate approach Stefan de Mistura, the former UN Special Envoy, had of exchanging lists of names and numbers was not functional, because not everybody in anybody's list, and the Syrian government will lie about those lists. And let's be clear here, it is the obligation of the Syrian state to produce the list of names and the registry and the location of detention and the fate of those people. And it's not the liability of anybody else. And the Syrian government is not doing it. And that's why the civil society and the human rights community is trying to do so. The other point, excuse me, is the advocacy efforts being carried by families, by survivors association, by former detainees, by activists, by the Sadnai Association. A lot of efforts trying to pressure international community to find a solution to the issue of detainees and missing. And Ambassador Banshak mentioned one thing, I put it in, it's the political will. The issue with the detainees is the political will. And I'll break this down a little bit. I'm just checking we don't have the slides. The issue of the political will is now, after a lot of advocacy and lobbying by the families and the survivors, the Secretary General assigned the Office of High Commissioner to draft a report, basically researching the possibility of creating a UN standalone mechanism to research the fate of those disappeared in Syria. Will the mechanism solve the issue? In our opinion, no. And that's why. The mechanism will need access to Syria. And our experience with the Syrian government, with the COI, with the IIIM, is no access. Unlike the IIIM, where the jurisdiction is outside, as Professor Seri mentioned, by the universal jurisdiction, and by the witnesses and the survivors and the victims and their families are all outside, the issue with the detainees is inside, is in the detention facilities, in the prisons that's not allowed for anybody to access. ICRC had some access to some detention facilities, but they do not share and they do not talk, and they're very limited with working in their humanitarian mission. And also the mechanism is being proposed to tell the fate of those disappeared in Syria. And that's different from releasing the currently alive detainees who are at risk of dying if we don't release them. Every day we lose people. COVID, we don't know how much we lost in detention during COVID. God knows how many people died. So the proposal to go to the UN to create a mechanism to tell the fate of the Syrian people, missing people, is important, but that's not sufficient. And that's what the point we're trying to tell. Like a lot of the families, like, oh, we deserve you deserve more than the mechanism. The mechanism is not enough. And with all due respect here, the mechanism is a very easy exit strategy and solution to the member states, not to the families. It's a solution to states who fail to do anything around the detainees and missings. And they're going to create a UN mechanism, pour some money on it. Okay, what are you doing for the detainees in Syria? We're funding the new mechanism to do it in the UN. And the mechanism will be sitting in Geneva because it will be denied access and will do nothing for the Syrian detainees. Now, what we're proposing is more practical thing, is the political will. Last year, Assad issued an amnesty in April 2022, April 30th or April 28th. He released around 500, 600 detainees, but that amnesty decree was influenced by the Emiratis. Assad went to Abu Dhabi borrowing money from the Emiratis, who told him, we cannot give you money with the Caesar Act in place. We will be sanctioned. Go do something, loosen up a little bit so we can argue on your behalf. So Assad issued the amnesty decree, but he released only a handful of people. But this is a sign that actually political will could work and somehow in structuring. Charles just texted me actually a tweet that the Saudis and the Syrian government just re-engage and they're going to exchange diplomatic representation. So they agreed to reopen their embassies. Now we have the Saudis and the Emiratis. We know Erdogan is very busy. He wants to just meet with Assad and reconcile with Assad and become friend with Assad. So we have a group of member states running to reintegrate Assad in the international community, or at least in the Arab region, in the Arab League, to come back to the Arab League with no cost. They're making it very cheap for him. It's costing him zero, nothing. Unfortunately, the earthquake came in his favor politically, where Assad and the Russian campaign started to bully the US and the West about the sanctions, which was not actually blocking humanitarian aid. Nevertheless, the US government put an exemption. Treasury quickly put General License 23 to allow for the aid to arrive to Syria quickly. Now, what we mean by the political will is leadership, and we do not have leadership on the issue of detainees in Syria. There's no leadership at the UN, there's no leadership with the Friends of Syria Coalition. I hope this group with Dr. Becker, with the support of the Congress, with the support of people like Ambassador Banshak, can bring some leadership to the issue of the detention and disappearance in Syria, because the issue is structure. We have a big debate on the political will issue, because detainees and missing people were included in the UN Resolution 2254 that the current special envoy is using as a base for the Geneva negotiation. So it is a political issue. A lot of families asking for depoliticizing the detainees issue and remove it from the negotiation track, because Assad is keeping people hostages till the negotiation's over. But the will to release those people is a political decision, and Assad is not going to cross the line to release those people unless have something in exchange. And this is not a proposal to re-engage with Assad clearly. It's to make re-engagement for those regional powers who's trying to re-engage with Assad and reintegrate him, make it at some cost. And the cost is human lives, releasing some people who are alive and still alive and in custody. I want to mention one example. In the last couple of years, since 2019, we've been working in Northeast Syria, supported by State Department. We've been working on the mass graves that ISIS left in Northeast Syria, from Raqqa to Deir ez-Zor. There's a lot of work happened there by the Kurdish authorities, was not up to scale, to standards. We joined with the Argentinian forensic anthropology team to create some standards, some best practices there. And we've been conducting contextual investigations about the disappearance. The slides are not working at all, right? Okay, I wanted to show one picture. One thing we managed to do in Northeast Syria is trace the movement of detainees that ISIS arrested. One arrested in Aleppo, moved to Raqqa, then tortured in Tabqa, then crossed to Iraq, and then returned, and they put them in a trial in Naqta 11 in Raqqa, and then there's a mass grave. And also what we managed to do is mapping the grave sites to the detention sites ISIS had. And if somebody detained in X location, likely if executed, will be buried in closed grave. They're not going to drive 200 miles to bury a dead body. So we're trying to do a lot of work there. We're trying to access the intelligence the US government collected from ISIS facilities. We submitted a couple of FOIAs to the US government, asking them if there's any detainees list from the records they sabotaged from ISIS buildings when the US and the Kurdish forces were in the battle against ISIS. We're trying to piece all these small pieces together, satellite images, looking at the graves, mapping them to the location of detention facilities, including taking pictures of former detention facilities, because every prisoner, including myself, engraved his name somewhere in some wall when they were arrested. So some people names will be there. But all of that is happening because of the access. We have unconditioned access to Northeast Syria. Thanks to the SDF and thanks to the US government for facilitating that, which unfortunately I do not see a UN specialized mechanism on the missings will enjoy. I think the Syrian government will handcuff such mechanism if they allow them ever enter Syria. So to recap, the issue of Syria, of the detainees, is not actually lack of the engagement from the families, is not lack of information. We have tens of documentations. And as Dr. Seri mentioned in the Koblenz case, detention and execution and disappearance were part of the charges Anwar Raslan faced in the case. But telling who's alive and who's not and releasing detainees is not going to be solved by assigning the issue to a UN entities that's not going to enter Syria. It needs more political will, it needs more leadership. When Lubna mentioned we were left behind, I remember the red line of President Obama. The red line actually brought us here all together because that gave a green light to everybody to do what they want, including on the detainees. So are we willing to establish some red line, at least for the engagement with Assad regionally, related to the detainees and related to the missings or not? That's the big question we should tackle. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for those insights, including your personal insights into the situation of detainees in Syria, and for your very practical suggestions for moving that issue forward and finding some way to appropriately address with sufficient political will the release or the call for the release of those detainees. We have about 10 minutes for question and answer. I see we do have one in the Q&A on the Zoom, and so if who's ever running the Zoom wants to pull that up, and then maybe we can take 2 or 3 additional questions and then have the panelists respond. So anyone want to ask a question, raise your hand. We've got a mic.
Thank you all for being here. It's obvious that we have lack of political will to approach this or whatever we're talking about. In 1 year, a little over 1 year, Putin is on the Hague now. It's for arrest. After 12 years, still nothing happening. I know there's few cases in Germany, in Netherlands, they're trying, but I think we have an old meeting with Ambassador Van Schaak about using the RICO. So the Syrian in general see the regime as a mafia, and the RICO was applied in the US to get rid of the mafia in the US, and there is no more mafia. If you look at the criteria, the criminals that being used under the RICO law, the Syrian has done a lot of them. The murder, money laundering, drug, tons of stuff. I have a list of them in here. If you want me to go through them, there are like probably 30, 35 ones. But he has been included in these things. And I don't know, both of you, you have more knowledge about this. If we can apply RICO law to go to the head of the mafia rather than tracking few people in Germany or in different countries. So thank you.
Let's take a few more questions and we'll bundle them together. We have one up here. And then can you pull the one up from the Zoom, the little Q&A? And I'll read it out loud. Up here in the front, ma'am. Thank you. Yes.
Just to comment. I think what emboldened Assad, that people, that the world community stayed quiet in between 79 to 82, when he killed more than 100,000 people and demolished the whole city of Hama, and nobody mentioned it. This is one thing about keeping quiet about criminal like Hitler. Even Hitler joined Russia to take Poland, and after that, he even invaded Russia. So you do not keep it quiet about the criminals. Now, for general jurisdiction, this is not 300 or 400 years. It is part of Islamic faith. More than 1400 years ago, several places in Quran mention that every human being is responsible if somebody was tortured or have unjust somewhere else. And if you look, and you know, now talking about Islam is taboo, but this is exactly what happened, that most of the wars in early Islam was because people from other countries came and complained about torture and killing. So Islamic war started just to relieve people from injustice. And it is mentioned several places in Quran.
Well, pass the microphone to Jude. And Jude, if you'll read the question that was just up there or on your computer.
Sure thing. So the question we have from the Zoom says, why was Jamid Hassan not extradited from Lebanon according to Germany's request and according with universal jurisdiction?
Great. Other questions? We have one right down here. We'll take two more and then we'll give the panelists 7 minutes to answer.
My question is on, Ukraine refer Putin to ICC. Now, can Ukraine refer Assad to ICC since Assad sending like militia to fight with Russia against Ukraine? Thank you. By the way, I mean, as far as like torturing of Assad has gone on since 1970. I have been in prison Assad in the 80s for 4 years, and it was horrible. Nobody talked about it. Thanks.
Thank you. One more question. I haven't seen this side of the table, so I'm leaning in. Anybody over here?
I have a question.
Okay.
If nobody.
Great.
I have a question, I think, for Muhammad. Thanks again for the great remarks. My question to you, and maybe to that question will probably carry on, for the work of this group. When we believe that Assad might comply with, maybe quote unquote demands from UAE and other countries, to maybe release detainees, I get the sort of pragmatic, if you would, like nature of this type of, suggestion, but at the same time, my gut feeling, having experienced this regime for the last 12 years, of course, and maybe longer, is that I don't think that will work. So my worry is, are we somewhat reinforcing Assad's father and son? They build their empire, if you would, or their kingdom on the taking Syrian as hostages, detainees, killing, etc. And then when those people try to get their loved ones out, then they, try to sort of negotiate and get some price back. So my worry is if we start to somehow bring that as a potential, valid suggestion, my worry is that first that might reinforce the behavior of Assad and, of course his circles. And number two, might also justify UAE and other countries who somehow believe Assad is rehabilitatable. So that's, I guess, again, I don't know if you have to have the answer today per se, but I think that's an important piece. And I'm hoping Ambassador Jeffrey and Ambassador Hoff eventually will also, sort of give some political, if you will, perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and I'll open it up to each of the panelists to discuss or answer the questions that they would like to. Jude, I want to first go to Lubna so that we don't forget her because she's on Zoom, and then we'll do Ambassador Van Check, Milena, Salim, and Mohammed.
Lubna actually had to leave.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to make sure that we didn't forget about her. If she left us, that's okay. Ambassador.
Great, well, thank you. So maybe I'll start with the RICO question. It's true that US law has not been that helpful in this context. We have been able to exercise jurisdiction over some individuals who left the United States, joined ISIL, and came back. We also have the Beatles case because victims of the Beatles, so-called Beatles, were US citizens. Our implementation of universal jurisdiction is a little bit idiosyncratic. So for acts of piracy, the original universal jurisdiction crime, many acts of terrorism, torture, many human trafficking crimes, genocide, and the use of child soldiers always had what was called present in jurisdiction. So the perpetrator had to be found in the US. We are not able to open a case and then seek the extradition of someone for one of these crimes. They have to be found here. Last term, Congress changed our War Crimes Act and made it now present in jurisdiction also. There's some questions about retroactivity there, whether it can be applied to acts prior to the passage of this new law. That will be theoretically litigated over the years, depending on whether the Department of Justice tries to bring a retroactive case. So that, for the War Crimes Act, it's only for individuals from now forward who commit war crimes and are found here. We have two statutes that are relevant for the chemical weapons situation. One is the use of chemical weapons, and then one is on weapons of mass destruction. Unfortunately, both of those statutes require either the perpetrator or the victim to be a US person. So it's not helpful in the Syrian context unless you have like a dual national or there's a US citizen that's harmed. That is an area that's, I think, open for advocacy because we've seen now the changes in our War Crimes Act. Why would we not also want to harmonize some of these other more particular statutes? So I'm hopeful that Congress will take that up. RICO does not apply extraterritorially, again, unless you have the person present. And so that's why it's not a perfect fit, even though your observation is entirely correct that the Assad regime is a criminal enterprise on all different fronts, including with respect to drugs, et cetera. So we may be able to think about some kind of we call it the Al Capone strategy, where you prosecute somebody for something else. So maybe for drug trafficking, for example, where we have very strong extraterritorial laws, if we could show that there was some way to use those laws in this context. But your point is an excellent one. We just haven't been able to use the laws because of the way they're drafted and this requirement that the perpetrator be present in the US.
Thank you. Milena.
Sure, so I won't comment on the RICO statute as Ambassador Vanskak has very well, explained why this statute isn't as useful as you would hope it would be. But let me briefly comment about the International Criminal Court and the fact that the ICC had just issued arrest warrants against Putin, whereas the ICC has not been able to be involved in the Syrian situation. The problem here is jurisdiction. So the ICC has jurisdiction in cases where crimes are committed on the territory of a member state or are committed by nationals of a member state. In the case of Putin and Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. And so because of that, the ICC has jurisdiction over crimes committed on Ukrainian territory. Syria is not a member state of the International Criminal Court. And for the most part, crimes that we're talking about have been committed by Syrian nationals.
My information, Ukraine was not listed too.
But Ukraine accepted the
Ukraine was not a member.
Asked someone else to represent them. So I think the Syrian asked some European country or the US to represent us.
No, so in the case of the ICC, Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. There's a procedure in the Rome Statute of the ICC which allows countries to accept the jurisdiction of the court on an ad hoc basis. So Ukraine is not a member, but it has accepted the jurisdiction of the court. Now, so because of this, in the Syrian context, the ICC is not a possibility. Now, the other way the ICC can exercise jurisdiction is if there's a United Nations Security Council referral, such as, for example, in the situation of Darfur. But as we know very well, Russia is an obstacle as it has veto power on the Security Council, and so that avenue, unfortunately, isn't particularly helpful right now. And so that is not to say that there isn't a will at The Hague to do something about the Syrian situation, but right now the jurisdictional regime of the ICC doesn't allow for investigations or prosecutions in Syria, other than perhaps crimes committed by foreign nationals in Syria, if those foreign nationals come from member states of the ICC. So if you have a French or a German national committing crimes in Syria, that person could technically be prosecuted by the ICC. And somebody asked a question about the extradition. Why was Al-Hassan not extradited from Lebanon if there's universal jurisdiction, if there's a case in Germany? Extradition is ultimately a political act. And so just because there's an extradition request sent to a particular country, that country does not always have to honor that extradition request. And so we've unfortunately seen many situations where countries simply do not honor extradition requests. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Let's turn to Salim and then to Mohammed. Okay, no additional comments. That's great. That keeps us on time. Mohammed, over to you.
So I want to answer Dr. Becker's question about the engagement with Assad. Indeed, Assad, the Assad regime, they played, I'm losing the mic here, but yeah, okay, it's good. The Assad regime played two games. One, waiting and gaining time because things will change. People are suffering, let them die. As his and his family are fed and protected, that's fine. Second thing, they're really good in creating problems, manufacturing new problems that they only can solve. The Captagon one, for example. Okay, we're going to dump Captagon on the neighbors, and you're not going to be able to find how we do it, and we will be solved. Now, what happened around the amnesty, there's a very new thing in code happened. Sham FM, the Syria state radio, sponsored by the Syrian government, had a Facebook Live from the street with thousands of families waiting in the middle of the street, expecting their loved ones to be released. Of course, the Syrian government had also an inhuman way of releasing people. They didn't mention where they will be released and how. They let people in the middle of the street midnight with no cash. Even if you had 10,000 pounds in your pocket, is not good for a taxi ride for now after years of detention. And people were just gathering in the street waiting for their loved ones, and they're listening to rumors, and lawyers were there, unfortunately, and security agents trying to blackmail the families. Okay, the list with me, I'll slide one name in if you pay now $1,000 in the spot, and they've done that a lot. But what if Sham FM did live the first time ever? They went and interviewed families of detainees by the Syrian government, by the Syrian regime. And the story was heartbreaking. Okay, I'm waiting for my 4 children. I'm waiting for my son and his 2 children. I'm waiting for my husband and all his brothers. And the story, which was a propaganda supposedly to the Syrian government, ended up against them. So they had to delete the video 2 days later. We have that video if anybody interested. Yeah. The comments though were new also. For the Syrian government or Assad's loyalists and supporters who always were like, hey, kill them, they're terrorists, we support you. The narrative is different. We're starved here because of the economic sanctions and because of the economic situation, because you're keeping those people. And according to your amnesty, they committed no crime because the amnesty excluded people who committed murders. It just engaged in terrorism act. So why don't you release all of them and we get our financial assets back? So there is a trend internally that's emboldened by the sanctions that Assad is actually starved with his base and they're not pleased with that. And he's looking for solutions. Okay, the money he robbed from the earthquake relief, we carry him for a couple of months, but it's not going to be a strategy. What we're proposing is the government who could afford him financially, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, even Turkey, if they engage in trade, they do not do it with no cost. And I engaged with a lot of member states after the amnesty. And I don't want to cite diplomatic conversations, but the Emiratis communicated with one important player internationally who said, we're not going to issue a statement welcoming the release if the Americans are not going. And the Americans are not going to do it. If anybody did it, like the US cannot do it. So there's a game here. Nobody wants to take a leadership role and say the difficult things. Actually, we have to make the re-engagement, which is happening. The Emiratis and the Saudis are not even listening to the US. In Russia and Ukraine, they went to China to negotiate a deal with Iran. they're working against the US administration, at least against this administration, not against the US strategically. So they're not listening. They're going that route. I hope Ambassador Jeffrey will comment on this. But let's make their re-engagement with Assad it's costly to Assad, releasing people, no promises of relief of sanctions unless we see meaningful release of detainees, unless we see ICRC access to detention facility, unless we see you are allowing the ICRC to register detainees inside Syria and missing people. Some EU officials mentioned that the Emiratis might have overpromised Assad on their own, and they failed to deliver in that, and that's not our fault. We're not going to deliver on their promises. But the detainees was an issue, actually, when Assad went to borrow money, and this is 100% confirmed, that the Emiratis told him, go release some people so we can help you. Help us help you. We cannot just block or ignore the sanction. So I think there's a room there, not to rehabilitate Assad clearly, it's to make the cost of his re-engagement in the Arab League, which is happening. Only Qatar now is holding of letting him back, but everybody else is almost. Algeria is already in there because they're in Putin's pocket. Same like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Emirat. But now the Qatar is not going to last alone for a long time. But let's get something out of this transaction because there's some people alive and we could release them. Now, the UN missing persons mechanism, standalone mechanism, could work in long term to tell us about the fate of those who were executed and died in custody, yes, but not on releasing the detainees. That's the point. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. In just a moment, we're going to turn it to Milena for closing remarks and future planning. Yesterday, Dr. Bakir asked me if I would just make a couple of quick comments on the indictment of Putin, and it came up in a couple of observations. And the question of what does this tell us about accountability and how can it be utilized for the pursuit of accountability in the Syria context. And there's just 5 quick takeaways from the indictment of Putin. As we know, a week ago, Friday, the International Criminal Court indicted President Putin for the crime of abducting and deporting children from Ukraine to Russia. They also indicted his minister in charge of that agency for conducting that. The first important point to pull from this is that what the Syrian Accountability Working Group is doing really does matter. And Milena and I and Beth have spent years of our lives, making the rallying cry for justice and the need for just peace and the need for justice for durable peace. And it's always the 7th or 8th issue down on the table. But with the International Criminal Court indicting the president of a permanent 5 nuclear former superpower, it reminds everyone that the world community actually does think justice not only plays a role, but plays a key role in ending a conflict, deterring atrocity crimes, and setting the stage for a durable peace. The second is it does away with this notion of peace versus justice. And when we were providing assistance to the Syrian opposition in the Geneva negotiations, we were constantly told by the United Nations, by others, and by some members of the opposition that no. If you indict Assad and the leadership, that will undermine the ability to get a negotiated peace to end the war. Clearly, that view has changed. If the International Criminal Court has indicted President Putin, the international community has figured out, yes, you can still get to a negotiated peace. You can still end a war while holding someone accountable. And quite frankly, holding the leadership accountable might hasten the pace of the negotiations and hasten the pace of the end of the war. The third, head of state immunity. Well, the tribunals, they only indict mid-level and low-level. Okay, there's Charles Taylor and there's Milosevic. But no, there's head of state immunity. There's a sort of an informal arrangement not to indict heads of states. That has also, no one should say, oh, well, President Assad, that would be tricky because he's the head of state. International Criminal Court just erased that objection. The fourth is the value of a concerted effort to utilize and to create mechanisms, which has been talked about here a little bit today, to prosecute those responsible for atrocity crimes. The Ukrainian government has an array of individuals whose full-time job it is to pursue accountability for the crimes that were being committed in Ukraine. They've amplified and energized the global network of organizations, civil society, and others who are committed to ending impunity and holding individuals accountable. We can see the outcome of that. There's a lot of space that exists for the Syrian opposition and for domestic organizations like the Syrian Accountability Working Group to, push this hybrid tribunal. Years and years ago, there was a group of former prosecutors got together, drafted a model statute for a hybrid tribunal that the Syrian opposition could get behind and put out there. It's still relevant. We see what can be done in the General Assembly. There's all kinds of opportunities for the Syrian opposition, for organizations such as the Syrian Accountability Working Group to push these issues of accountability before the General Assembly. And the fifth point is, it's important to have a roadmap. And we were having this conversation before the panel today, that you need a roadmap. There are actual ways of getting to accountability, but the landscape is very patchy. We've heard about universal jurisdiction. We've heard about the applicability and inapplicability of some of the US legislation. We heard about the varying levels of jurisdiction for the International Criminal Court. Melina was being polite, but it's a complicated mess. And you really do need a roadmap to try to figure out how to get to accountability. And that's where I want to applaud the work of the Syrian Accountability Working Group for bringing these minds together and thinking, all right, how do we get there? We know where we want to go. How do we get there? Political will, legal basis, jurisdiction, innovative ideas, and support from the Syrian diaspora. So Melina, how do we get there? Jeffrey's on. So jump on it.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? Thanks, Paul. So, as we have discussed this morning, as this event has documented, there is a pressing need to establish accountability for the atrocities committed during the Syria conflict. As Ms. Al-Kanawati has explained in much detail, Syrian authorities have used chemical weapons against civilians, have committed major violations of international law, and have caused tremendous harm within Syria. As she also adequately mentioned, accountability for Syrian perpetrators of atrocities is unfortunately foreclosed in some way through the United Nations Security Council because of the Russian veto. Dr. Salim Namour's experience in Ghouta also clearly confirms that chemical weapons have been used against civilians and that the use of such weapons has caused tremendous injuries. As Dr. Namour has effectively argued, impunity for Assad may encourage other rogue leaders, including Vladimir Putin, to use chemical weapons against their own populations with no consequences. And finally, Mohammed al-Abdallah has also detailed the brutality of the Assad regime, including disappearances, arbitrary detentions, as well as the mistreatment and torture of those detained by the Assad regime. One important accountability option, as I explained earlier, includes national level prosecutions under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Such prosecutions have already taken place in the courts of European countries such as Germany, France, Sweden, Austria, and Switzerland. It is important for the international community, including for the United States, to support such domestic level universal jurisdiction-based prosecutions. Now, the international community has already acted in some ways through the United Nations General Assembly to establish an investigative mechanism for Syria, which we have also mentioned, the so-called Triple IM. The Triple IM can also support universal jurisdiction-based investigations and prosecutions, but it is time for the international community, as well as for the United States, to do more to support accountability. And last, I would argue that imposing accountability on Syrian leaders in particular is paramount in the wake of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the commission of atrocities there by Russian forces. It is crucial to establish that accountability attaches to all those who ordered the commission of atrocities, whether they be located in Ukraine or in Syria. And this group can hopefully assist in those accountability efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Makir, over to you.
Well, I think this is just the start. Obviously, this, as everybody stated, this is a long road and need a map for sure, roadmap for sure, to unfold a lot of unknowns, I guess, and I do think each country has its own issues. Obviously, Syria is very complicated because of its regime, not because of other factors. But again, we appreciate everybody's time. I know it's been 2 hours, and I know it's a long time for everybody to sit down and talk about anything. So we really appreciate everybody's valuable time that you guys took today to listen and discuss this very important and dear issue for Syria. 12 years of brutal crimes, and for that to go unaccounted for is just unfair and just not right. So again, we appreciate the time, Ambassador, professors, and everybody from the group who came today. There is, I'm told by Jude and Nina that there's a book here that I think some of you might be familiar, Witnesses to War, The Children of Syria, that has beautiful quote unquote photos from the siege of Ghouta that is written or reviewed and edited by Leslie Thomas and Amy Yenkin. Thanks so much for them to offer to give some free copies for folks to take with you today. And again, we will continue to work on this. I'm hoping we will convene virtually with the members of the group to continue this long trip. So thanks everybody for again coming today, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I have one question? Just you mentioned about